How prepared is your team? Will you be ready when the worst case scenario occurs or when the big business opportunity presents itself? Today, we talked with Afterburner team member Bill Borneo Gregory, fighter pilot, test pilot, and even astronaut. He uses his 40 years of experience in complex, dynamic, high-stakes environments to help business teams succeed. Borneo is faced with life-threatening emergencies as a test pilot and then life-altering opportunities as an astronaut. Hear how he prepared for both on this episode of the Business Thorcast. We are Afterburner, a team of former elite military members. Think fighter pilots, Navy SEALs, and Army Rangers. We've taken the lessons learned from the cockpit and the battlefield to the business world to develop elite teams with leaders like you. For over 20 years, we've helped teams succeed across the globe. I'm Thor, the president of Afterburner. Welcome to the Business Thorcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Business Thorcast. I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have this week. You know, very often we talk about the value proposition that Afterburner and our team of former elite military personnel like fighter pilots and Navy SEALs, the value proposition that we can offer to the business world is that we can help them to operate in very complex, very dynamic, very high-stakes environments because that's where we came from. And we know that's where a lot of the business teams are in right now. And we know that the environment that they're encountering that they've got to navigate effectively. I'm really excited about the conversation I'm going to have today because the gentleman we're going to talk to right now spent most of his career on the cutting edge of a high-stakes, dynamic, challenging environment where his life was on the line every single day. First, as a fighter pilot, then a test pilot, and then finally as an astronaut as he flew into space. Bill Gregory, welcome to the Thorcast.
Hey, Thor, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Well, we're really excited to have you here, and let's get the most important question out of the way right up front. Your call sign is Borneo. Why is your call sign Borneo?
Well, in the fall of 1976, I was a member of Cadet Squadron 33 Cellarettes at the Air Force Academy. We had a weekly award for the grossest, most decrepit act of the week. I won it 2 weeks in a row. Somebody started calling me Borneo Bill, kind of like Barnacle Bill, the sailor. Anyway, so it was Borneo Bill, and it stuck. So long before there was a Maverick or a Goose, there was a Borneo. So what is that? It's over 40 years now.
Do we want to ask what the gross out stories were that you were able to achieve this illustrious call sign with?
You can ask away, but there isn't enough alcohol in the state of Georgia to find out. Nobody remembers, and I'm not telling.
Gotcha. All right. Fair enough. Well, suffice it to say, you know, that we always say behind closed doors that there's a 2-beer minimum for the majority of our call sign stories, and that that the real story is always more exciting than the cover story that we present. And the same is true for mine as Thor, and someday I might reveal that. But I appreciate and respect the fact that you're not ready to give up the story for Borneo. So what an opportunity, you know, where do we start with your career and all the experiences that you've had, first as a fighter pilot, then as a test pilot, and finally as an astronaut along the way. Let's begin with a story from your fighter pilot days, and you talk to the listeners about a challenging environment that you found yourself in, something that scared you, something that tested you, and what you took away from that as a fighter pilot or test pilot.
Well, of course, fighter pilots never get scared. But what you're really asking me is something that got my attention.
There you go.
So I'll tell you about something that got my attention. And it's kind of funny because, you know, in the F-111, with no visual outside, we were flying night low level through the mountains. As low as 200 feet was the lowest setting. And so normally you would think that that's where you would be susceptible. But actually, you know, in those situations, you're all keyed up, you're ready to go. The one that got my attention was during a normal part of flight, takeoff. And, you know, normally takeoff's pretty routine. And I was in the right seat acting as the instructor. I had a senior lieutenant colonel in the left seat, a friend of the wing commander, and he was going through recurrency training. And we took off, he brought the gear up, and right after we got a wheel well hot light. And what that meant was we had bleed air pouring into the wheel well, which is about as high risk with the exception of an in-flight fire, because you have two things that are very combustible. You've got the main tires, which are huge tires on the F-111, and if they start on fire, that is a major problem. And then you also have these fuel lines that are about 4 or 5 inches in diameter, carrying fuel to the engines right there in the vicinity of this bleed air. And so what you need to do is go from your routine of, hey, we just took off, we're heading to where we need to go, to suddenly, now I have to get this on the ground because it can light us on fire. And you remember the amount of fuel you had in the F-15. Well, we carried 34,000 pounds of internal fuel, which is kind of like the total weight of an F-15 or an F-4.
Yeah.
So we had about 20,000 pounds of fuel right there, ready to get lit. So what we needed to do is I needed to run the boldface procedure. We had to get the landing gear immediately down and turn off the air source selector. So hopefully shut off the flow of hot air, get the landing gear out of that wheel well so that you would get cool air circulating in there. And then, of course, get the plane landed as soon as possible. So we really didn't have time to dump fuel. What we just did was we just brought it around, did a visual approach, and we had it back down on the runway in probably about 3 minutes. So we landed with almost a full load of fuel. And so we were weighing about 80,000 pounds, about 30,000, 32,000 pounds of fuel still left on board, and managed to actually land and didn't have to use the hook and didn't end up with hot brakes. So it
Wow.
all worked out pretty darn well.
So looking back and just kind of translating some of the airplane speak for the listeners, that the bleed air is one of the biggest emergency procedures that you could ever have inside of an aircraft. And what that really means is you got a blowtorch somewhere inside of your airplane, and that blowtorch, which is just incredibly hot fire, could be pointed at fuel lines, it could be pointed at your tires, which are explosive, and yet is gear up inside the aircraft. And so there's a chance that those tires are going to explode and at a minimum make it unlandable. In a worst case scenario, explode the entire airplane. And so there's few things in an airplane that give you more pause or make you more afraid than seeing a bleed air malfunction, which is exactly what Borneo is referring to here. Here's what I take away from this that I think the listeners would appreciate. We talk to teams a lot. I just talked to a sales team last week in charge of about $700 million worth of sales, and they are opening up to new opportunities, and the market's opening up for them. They talk about the escalation of the CIO, where all of a sudden this tech team has access to larger budgets, larger opportunities in the marketplace, because every company in every industry is talking about using technology as a strategic leverage point for their teams. And so the CIO, all of a sudden, who used to be the one who just kept the email running and the lights on, is now somebody who has a strategic seat at the table with a leadership. And tech companies love that because they get excited about the opportunity and selling into a larger budget. But here's what they keep bumping into. They keep being challenged by the fact that the stakeholders in the sale, the number of stakeholders have increased. In other words, it used to just be somebody within the CIO's vertical they're selling to, sometimes the CIO himself, and now they are having to sell into lines of business along with the CIO with this deal, and it's breaking a lot of these deals. Here's the parallel I'm driving for this. You had what is a very unlikely situation, but a predictable one in the bleed air light challenge. And they knew that in the past we had seen this type of thing before in aircraft, and you had a checklist waiting for you to execute to be able to land safely. Why don't you tell one more time, what did you do? As soon as you see this bleed air light, you said, I went through the boldface. What does that mean for the crowd that's listening about your response?
Sure. Right. So part of the checklist, the immediate response items, you have to commit to memory, word for word. And so that was the first thing that I did. Air source selector knob off, landing gear handle down. Okay. So those two things you need to accomplish absolutely positively as soon as possible. And then of course land as soon as possible. So having that checklist, very much similar to the checklist that we try and teach companies, having that checklist in place and referring to it and believing in that checklist was hugely important. And I think part of the thing is that, this occurred during a very normal, very relaxed part of flight, not one of the more intense parts of the operation that
Yeah.
day. And so I think it's important for people to realize, in business, you get opportunities sometimes when you least expect it. You're always on your game when you're giving a presentation or when you're working on a proposal team, but sometimes with a chance meeting, when you're least expecting it, that's when you have to perform.
Yeah.
And that's when the checklist worked for me.
Yeah, great example because it could be a good or a bad. It's called contingency planning in our world. Typically for emergency procedures, of course, it's a bad scenario we're trying to mitigate, and very often with the teams that we are supporting, they're looking to mitigate bad scenarios as well. But if you listen closely to what Borneo said, he didn't have the entire landing mapped out from start to finish for what he was going to accomplish after this emergency occurred, but he did have his initial actions mapped out. And so when we start to see, let's go back to my analogy with the CIO escalation and new opportunities that are coupled with more stakeholders and more people to say no to your deal that are involved. When you start seeing those initial signs for that bad scenario developing where there's too many stakeholders and your deal is in jeopardy, you should have the initial actions mapped out for your team. You should know exactly what next steps to take, whether that's elevating this to the executive team internally that you've got and taking the executive team and going CIO to CIO or even CEO direct and having this conversation more aggressively. Whatever the steps are, you need to at least have those first initial steps. What's your boldface that you're going to use for your team for these predictable threats? And you're saying, yeah, but they're not that predictable. It's different every time. I disagree. I do the debriefs with these sales teams, with these software development teams, with these med device operations teams. And when you do debriefs, you'll start to see trends emerge, and you'll see that you're bumping up against the same problems on a pretty reliable, predictable basis. And if it's starting to be predictable, we can figure out a way around it, at least the initial steps for the team. So great example. You saved a fighter aircraft from crashing, from blowing up, landed it in a very challenging configuration when it's extremely heavy, and did it very quickly because you knew the proper steps to begin executing as soon as the emergency occurred. So what everybody really wants to hear about, and I know what I'd like to hear about as well, an astronaut. First of all, how did you get chosen to be an astronaut, Borneo? What was that process like?
Well, they didn't just come pluck me out of the background.
Yeah.
You applied first. I had to apply through the United States Air Force. I was selected to go ahead and be available to apply to NASA. I was very fortunate. I was selected the very first time I applied, so it was a good deal all the way around.
Wow. That's amazing. And this is at the height of the space shuttle program. This is at the height of challenges as well. The Challenger going down in 1986. You're brought into NASA a couple years later as an astronaut. And tell us about the days and the training leading up to your flight in a space shuttle.
Well, it's kind of interesting as you're training. You train for about a year, but it's at a low level initially. And then as you get closer to the mission, you get the highest priority in the simulator. 2 weeks before the launch, you go to the Kennedy Space Center and you climb in the actual vehicle and you run through a practice launch, which is a TCDT, Terminal Countdown Test. And so you do everything. You're all suited up. You do it just like it's the real McCoy. The difference is the vehicle is basically inert. It's dead. There's virtually no power on it. It's a beehive of activity. A lot of people are working on it, getting it ready for the launch. On launch day, once they load the fuel, the liquid oxygen and the liquid hydrogen, it's a bomb. It's just too dangerous to have people out there. And so the other side of the coin is now the vehicle is coming alive. It's got electricity on it. It creaks and it moans because of the cryo, the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. And so it's this beast that's slowly awakening as you approach the launch. And so as you start powering things up, you get more and more activity, more and more noise, less and less reliance on the outside world. So what was going on is we had bad weather. The weather in our board sites was fine, but the weather at the Kennedy Space Center was poor. They gave us a 1 in 5 chance, or 20%. In fact, it was predicted bad enough early enough that my congressman, who was a new congressman, he had never had an astronaut from his district. His aide told him, "Don't bother going. They're not going to get off." We're sitting in the vehicle, and you have to understand, we get in the vehicle like 5 hours prior. We get a
Yeah.
weather brief, but we can't see outside because it was a night launch, like 1:30 in the morning. There are these big spotlights shining on the windows, so we can't see outside.
Yeah.
All you see is the brightness of the lights. So we can't see what's going on with the sky. We're getting weather briefs over the radio. As we're coming down, it sounds like it's only going to get worse. And so as we work our way through the checklist, get closer and closer to the launch, it's pretty obvious that if we don't get off in the beginning, the early portion of the launch window, then that's going to be it. It sounds like we're going to use the nasty S word, scrub. And of course, in the back of your mind, what's going through your mind? Oh, my family's here, and oh, they're going to be so disappointed. I had, like 100 guests
Yeah.
there for the launch. They're all out there. So now you're thinking about, oh, Jimmy Christmas. Now they're all going to have to go back on the buses, back to the hotel, and we're going to have to try this again tomorrow. What a mess this is going to be. Okay. And so all of this stuff, because there was a big party that I threw beforehand. Of course, I'm not there. The guest of honor isn't at the party. It's like
Yeah.
a wedding, but you're not at the wedding. And so everyone's excited. They went from the party straight to the launch, and all the enthusiasm is riding high, and here Mother Nature is trying to deny you. So as we got closer and closer to the launch time, we kept progressing through the checklist. And that includes doing some things like starting the hydraulic units, the auxiliary power units. And once you start those up, there's a certain amount of time they can run, and then they have to be reserviced. So when they had me go ahead and do the pre-start, which was not such a big deal, like 7.5 minutes out, then like at 4 minutes or so, they had me start those APUs. Then it was obvious. Okay, so now we've started a clock. We only have so much time to get this bird off the ground. So by God, they're shooting for the beginning of the window, and they're just going to call it because it's not going to get any better. It's only going to get worse. We keep counting down 2.5 minutes. We close our visors, turn the O2 on, or oxygen on the suit. The gantry moves away, and it's like, wow, they're really taking this down to the limit. But we in the vehicle, we had no real indication that we were going to get off the ground. And the reason was we couldn't see outside. And what we didn't realize was the skies had parted and the stars were out. It had stopped raining. It had been raining this whole time. And for us, nobody ever said, hey, we're going to get this thing off, because everyone's being professional. They're running this stuff. They're looking at the weather. So as you get down, you get to T minus 31 seconds. And at T minus 31 seconds, you go to auto sequence start, which means the vehicle is now in charge. Mission control hasn't taken over. Launch control has relinquished command. And so now the vehicle is in charge of the launch, and it's counting down. We're watching, we're monitoring.
Yeah.
The computer running the show, and only at that point did I realize, holy Christmas, we're going to go. And so with 31 seconds to go, then suddenly it dawns on me, oh my gosh, we're actually going to go today. And so it's funny because everything was so routine, everything was automatic, and then all of a sudden we're expecting to abort, and all of a sudden we get this auto sequence start, and it's like, whoop, time to catch up. And so 30 seconds goes pretty quick, especially when 24 seconds into that the engines start.
Yeah.
So 7 seconds to go. The engines and the whole vehicle, starts shaking with the engines. And the next thing you know, we get the boosters lit. I watch the tower go by the commander's windows, and away we go.
Wow. So you are, and just so the listeners can really experience this, you are laying on your back, right? You're looking straight up. And you're on your back for hours, correct? Yeah, who knows how long this is going to be. You're looking straight up at bright lights from the launch pad, and these lights are in your face, so you can't see the clouds above you. When you got strapped in, the clouds are terrible, the weather's terrible, and
Yep.
then by some miracle, the clouds part momentarily. We call it a sucker hole as pilots. The hole in the weather that
Yep.
occurs that goads you into
Absolutely.
launching, and you go from daydreaming and waiting for them to abort the mission to all of a sudden hearing that in 31 seconds you are going to be departing Mother Earth in a space shuttle. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And boy, you talk about waking up in a hurry. It was like we were being lulled into this, and you have to understand, the crews don't want to abort for a variety of reasons, but one of them is the quickest way out of that spacesuit is to go to space.
Yeah.
Because if they have to come out and get you out, it's going to be a couple of hours of pulling you out one person at a time, whereas it's 8.5 minutes from liftoff to orbit.
Wow.
And so, yeah, it's very quick. And so and of course, everything happens fast. And so what's funny is there's so many wires in the computers, it actually takes several seconds for the data to get through all the sensors, all the wires through the computers and onto your display. So there really isn't anything pressing to see in the first couple seconds. And so that's why I was looking out the window and I could see everything. And then by the time we cleared the tower, everything's black outside because we're away from the spotlights. And then all we could see was the displays inside. And then away we went, and you're busy monitoring all the different equipment and checking to make sure that everything's working.
And then what do you see? This was the most interesting thing to me when you've told me this story in the past. What do you see moments after that? So it's all black, you're in just darkness in the night. What do you see next?
What happens is as you get higher and as you get faster and further out of the atmosphere, what ends up happening is there's no airflow going by the vehicle. And you have all this propellant coming out of the trailing end of the engines, and it wants to go anywhere because it's
Yeah.
high pressure. And so what ends up happening is that propellant, all those balls of flame, they start coming around the vehicle and slowly engulfing the vehicle in flames.
Wow.
And so eventually you start seeing the flames licking the windows above your head. And eventually, and of course, you don't see this on TV because we're so far away. We're just a dot at
Yeah.
that point. But in the vehicle, you see these flames basically engulfing the vehicle. So it's real nice to know about this ahead of time.
Wow.
And of course, that's just for the four of us up on the flight deck. There's three people who are downstairs, and all they see is a bunch of lockers shaking in front of them.
They're hanging on every word. I had no idea that people were in the space shuttle in the basement while you
Oh
guys
yeah,
were taking off.
yeah. It's called the mid deck. There's three people down there,
Yeah.
and the minimum crew you normally have a minimum of five and a maximum of seven, so that you've always got one person down there. Because after Challenger, they came up with a procedure where you can, if you're gliding but you're not going to make it to a runway, you can blow the hatch, put this pole out, and then you attach your parachute to a pole. And what the pole does is it guides you underneath the leading edge of the wing so you don't end up like bugs stuck to a hot radiator
Oh my gosh.
sticking to that leading edge. So the pole is just enough to get you into the airflow that it carries you under the wing instead of into the wing, which is a good thing.
That's amazing. And the visuals I get when you tell me this story of you sitting on your back, bored, hoping that this is going to happen, but knowing it probably won't, staring into these bright lights for hours on end. The congressman's not there. The family's sitting outside under umbrellas. This isn't going to happen. You're disappointed. And then all of a sudden you hear in 31 seconds, we're going to be airborne. And by the way, in 24 seconds, the engines are going to start and you're going to get the rumble of your life. So your hands better start moving now to start executing the takeoff sequence and getting the machine ready to leave the Earth's gravitational pull. and then you start moving up, the lights go away because the launch pad's gone. It becomes completely black, and the next thing you see are those flames lick in the window. And the other thing you told me that was amazing is you're now watching the sunrise because there's no darkness in space, right? Now you're seeing it's daytime again, basically, as you're chasing, as you're going outside of the shadow of the Earth at the same time. Is that right?
Right. Absolutely, because you're heading east, so you're heading toward the sunrise,
Yeah.
and so as we got over the Atlantic, then suddenly we hit. It's referred to as the Terminator, where you start to get the sun. But yeah, so
The
all of a
Terminator.
sudden during this 8.5 minutes, and boom, there's the sunrise, and all of a
Wow.
sudden you're in beautiful sunlight, and you can see the Earth for the first time.
Wow. That is amazing. All right, so you're now in space. And by the way, you guys set some amazing records during this space shuttle run that wasn't supposed to happen because of bad weather. What were you guys able to accomplish during this particular trip?
Oh yeah, we were actually the longest space shuttle mission ever up until that point, and nearly 17 days, 262 orbits, 7 million miles, about 400 hours in space. And so we had three ultraviolet telescopes on board, and we were looking at distant galaxies. In fact, the furthest galaxy was 130 million light years away.
Wow.
So the light that came into our telescope had been traveling for 130 million years.
Wow. So you're seeing a picture from the past 130 million years ago as you look through that telescope. That's amazing.
Right.
What was the most startling, surprising thing about being in the weightlessness of space for you?
It's funny because as soon as you get to 0 G, we're going from 3 Gs
Yeah.
through our chest instantly to 0 Gs. And
Oh,
so it's this
ouch.
instantaneous transition where you go from 3 Gs being pushed back in the seat to all of a sudden everything's floating.
That sounds
And
disorienting.
so, well, that's the problem. All this blood that has been in your legs and your arms now travels to your midsection and your head, and then your semicircular canals, the little hairs in that. Now it's frantically trying to find gravity. So the last thing that you want to do is move abruptly. So what you do is you move very slowly and very deliberately, trying not to trigger any sort of
Yeah.
negative response from your body.
Yep, I remember the exact same sensation in the centrifuge when it would slow down and you feel it go from 3 Gs to 0 Gs very quickly, and it's the most disorienting feeling ever as your head tries to make up or down of the world as the fluids spinning in your semicircular canals inside your ears. So you're weightless
Yeah,
now. What
yeah, and
was?
one of the things along with it, very similar to what you're saying, is for instance, if the space vehicle, if the orbiter is upside down, and you come up the stairs
Yeah.
from the mid deck, from downstairs, you come up the stairs, and then you come through the hatch into the flight deck, and then you see your outside view is, oh my God, I'm upside down.
Yeah.
And I'm actually not, I'm not climbing the ladder up. I'm actually climbing the ladder heads down.
Ugh.
And so all of a sudden your brain is like, oh my goodness.
Trying to make sense of this visual that you're seeing that,
Sure.
but you're not feeling it at the same time. Wow.
Exactly. Just like in business, when all of a sudden you get thrown a curveball,
Yeah.
you're expecting one thing, and you get you see the exact opposite, and you think, oh my gosh, how am I going to recoup here?
Nice segue. I wish we could sit and talk about the flying and this entire time, but I do want to bring it back to business lessons and how this applies to groups that we've worked with. One of the most striking things that I take away from Borneo's story is he was not expecting to take off that day. He was not expecting this to be his big opportunity. He was expecting to have to unpack, go through the hour and a half to be removed from the shuttle, get your suit off, and maybe try this again another day, and hopefully not be told that they're just scrubbing this team altogether and they're going to go with a new one because it's taking too long for this to take place. But he got his shot. He got his opportunity, and he was told in 31 seconds, you are going to be taking off in the space shuttle. And that was his first notification that this was really going to happen. But the thing was, he had prepared for this so well that when the call came, his hands started moving, he started taking actions, he started going into the launch sequence so that he could succeed. And it seems like there's so many times when I'll run into business teams that are not ready for that big opportunity. It's not just about mitigating the emergency. It's not just about stopping the bleed air light when you're taking off in your fighter plane. It's about also taking advantage of the opportunities that you get when you are in front of the executive leadership team at the other company, when you do have access to this new strategic opportunity internally within your company. Are you going to be prepared? If you've got 31 seconds to articulate the value proposition for the direction you think things need to go, are you going to be able to do it in an efficient way to be able to take off your plan as well? Borneo, this is amazing. I got to save some for the next time we're going to talk, because we obviously could do this for 2 or 3 podcasts. Any last words or anything else you'd like to share from your experiences as a test pilot, as an astronaut, as an Afterburner facilitator before we give you back to your day?
For the last 4.5 years, I've been flying again, but for 14 years, I was a business executive.
Yeah.
I was working business development for Honeywell and a couple of smaller companies that supported it. And what I was able to do is I was able to take these experiences and then apply them to the business world, because it is a very protracted affair. Sometimes, as we both talked about, you have to be able to respond in an instant, and then other times, like some of the proposal efforts, can go on for years.
Yeah.
And it's like dragging on like a long battle. And so it's interesting that you wouldn't think that you could make these parallels between preparing to fight and the battle that you do in the business world, but actually it's very closely related.
Yeah.
And the preparation and the checklists and the ability to transition when you get thrown something that wasn't expected, it was a possibility, but it wasn't expected. Those kinds of things, there's some very distinct parallels between the two worlds.
Well said, and I couldn't agree more. You've just articulated the value proposition that Afterburner brings to the corporate world, and we're constantly striving to help teams build their contingency plans and identify those predictable, maybe low likelihood threats, but predictable ones that we can help to mitigate and come up with at least the initial actions, at least the boldface that takes care of the aircraft and takes care of the opportunity and keeps it safe and maneuvers it to the next phase. And then when you are presented with that once-in-a-lifetime shot, when things are working for you that day, are you prepared to take advantage of it? Do you have the initial steps of your checklist to leverage the big opportunity and to launch things for your business at the same time? These are the questions that we should be having with our teams, just like we did when we were fighter pilots and when you were an astronaut. Borneo, thank you so much for being on the show today. Fantastic insights and even better storytelling, and I can't wait to bring you on the next one, because there's so many other questions I have for you about your experiences.
Thanks, Thor. I really enjoyed it.
We did too. Well, take care. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to the Business Thorcast. For more information on today's episode, please visit our website at www.thebusinessthorcast.com. And if you like this podcast, please rate it and leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. Thor, over and out.